I hope I can speak loud enough because I'm actually a baritone. So when I sing a tenor part, my voice gets thrashed, so I'm good for one time through. Hopefully I can. It's blown on the song, okay? Okay, while I was still in university, I was in a church choir that sang that song, the New 23rd. And even now, sometimes at night when I can't sleep, I'll run that song through my head and take some comfort from its imagery and its promises. So let's explore some of that imagery this morning. Almost 40 years ago, I taught in Japan for a couple of years. Now, have you noticed that at our age, for most of us, almost everything seems to have happened, about 40 years ago, right? Anyway, I attended an expat church much like this one, and the pastor told us about a book. It's called something like A Shepherd on the 23rd Psalm, written by a man who tended sheep for a living. Now, for the record, according to him, sheep are really dumb, but they're also very vulnerable, so the shepherd has his work cut out for him. He pointed out that line, "He makes me lie down on green pastures." And he noticed that sheep will never lie down unless both of two conditions are met simultaneously. Number one, the sheep has to be completely stuffed with food. Think of it, sheep stand around all day and eat. That's their job. So, to lie down on lush green grass, which is their favorite food, and not be eating, they really have to be satisfied. Condition number two, they must feel completely safe. Sheep are always in danger of being attacked by something that wants to eat them. So they're very skittish, ready to run off at a moment's notice. So if they're going to lie down instead of being ready on their feet, they have to be confident that there's no threat anywhere nearby. Then there's that line, "He leads me beside still waters." Now, we would think of, it's a nice park or something like that, peaceful. But think about sheep. They're skittish, so bubbling streams make them nervous, and they don't want to stick their face in it to get a drink. So they'd rather go thirsty. That's not good for sheep. So the shepherd knows they're simple-minded creatures, and he doesn't expect them to not think and act like sheep. So the shepherd plans ahead and leads them to where the water is quieter, so this sheep can drink and become refreshed and remain healthy. God, our shepherd, does the same thing with us. He refreshes us in our helplessness and in our ignorance. Now, as you know, King David started out as a shepherd when he was a kid, and so he wrote this song about himself and us as sheep. So, say that with me. Let's be the sheep. Ba. Say it with me. Ba. Okay, great. Thank you for humoring me. Now, first, like sheep, we need the basics. We need food. We need safety. We need refreshment. But then, because God created us higher than the sheep, David broadens his analogy to particularly human traits. There's that line, "He refreshes or restores my soul." Now, whenever I read in Scripture that God is restoring something, that tells me it's because we lacked it in the first place. And it's true. We do get tired and discouraged, and we need refreshing and restoring. And so he does. Then, our shepherd helps us to honor him with our lives. Now, sheep don't even think about that kind of thing. But because we are created in God's image, it's as important to our well-being as is food, shelter, water, and safety. And again, God doesn't leave it to us to figure it all out on our own, because we're like dumb sheep. So it says he leads us in the path of righteousness. All we have to do is follow. Now, Pastor Phil had asked me to tell how this passage speaks to my own life. And it does on many levels, not just about sheep, but also about ants and locusts. But we'll get to that later. The first part of the psalm paints life as peaceful and content. But have you noticed that's not always the case? Bad things do happen. So how are we to interpret God's care and protection when life seems so unfair and difficult? Well, first remember there's a big difference between hurt and harm. Hurt is short-term. Harm runs deep. When we put sugar in our mouth, it doesn't hurt. It tastes good. But it harms our teeth over time with cavities. The dentist that drills our teeth doesn't harm us, but inflicts temporary hurt. And we willingly submit ourselves to this hurt in order to remediate the harm. God will not harm you, but sometimes it will hurt. Besides, what's the worst that can happen? We die and go to heaven? That's a promotion. So just chill. Now, here's one reason why I believe God will sometimes lead us through pain. It's for someone else's benefit. Think about in John's Gospel, chapter 9, about the man born blind. Now, Jesus' disciples figured they knew why this guy would have been born blind. So they asked him, Lord, is he being punished for his own sins or for the sins of his parents? Neither. So Jesus flips their world upside down and then explains to them in explicit detail. They'll say this in the gospel. Now hear this. Okay, he said that. He said, it's not because of his sins or his parents. This happened so the power of God will be seen in him. Period. And as you remember, Jesus did heal them, and it really got the attention of the Jewish ruling council. So this man had been born blind and lived with it for many years, but not because of anything he had done. God had chosen him to focus other people's attention on God. God's glory is often revealed through people like us. This never occurred to the disciples. Nor does it occur to us, at least not while it's happening. Just before Suzanne and I moved to Ecuador, we stayed for a short time at the home of an elderly man from the church who called himself a work in progress. Well, one day, he came to me and berated me, full of anger and accusations that were both unfounded and unfair. I wanted to defend myself, but in his state of mind, he would not have been able to hear it. So, I held my tongue, tried to remain calm, and said little. Then he left, still angry. And I was just surprised. I was hurt and surprised at what was going on inside of him. I asked God for strength and some insight. Well, a few days later, he apologized to me and said that after our encounter, he had gone off by himself and he felt horrible and that he had felt like crying. I told him, well, I felt horrible too, and I felt like crying. But then he said something that surprised me. He said, right after I chewed you out, I thought, wow, he really kept his cool. And he kept repeating that. And he told me that he also once learned to have a godly self-control and presence too. I then realized that God had used me as his tool to teach another one of his children something he needed for his own growth. Something that couldn't be learned just intellectually, because he'd read this kind of thing. But it needed to be demonstrated with skin in a real-life situation. I felt somewhat honored that God thought I was ready for such a role, not a role I would have chosen for myself. But God didn't ask me. He just prepared me well enough, pushed me in, and helped me get through it. And later, he actually gave me the gift of telling me why he did it. This sort of thing happens to all of us. Think of a time when God used someone else's example in adversity to teach or inspire you. And you have had that effect on other people sometimes, though you probably didn't know it. Now, sometimes our benefit, it's not, or the trouble we face are not for someone else's benefit, but for our own benefit in the future. One of the most impactful things I learned from studying physics is that God experiences time itself differently than we do. Here's a mind bender. Did you know your future is already God's past? Have you ever heard that God lives in the eternal present? Let's do a thought experiment. Do it with me. It won't take long, and it's important because it can actually broaden your eternal perspective. Imagine a string strung tightly across the room, from that end to that end. Now, imagine thousands of little ants walking along that string in single file, one after another, each one close behind the next. From this end of the string to that end. Now, in your mind's eye, zoom in on just one ant in the middle of the string and imagine what it experiences and sees from its perspective. Well, the string is narrow, so it can't turn around and go back. It can't know how long the string is, nor what's at the end of it. All it can do is keep plodding along in the same old direction at the same old pace, only perceiving what's directly in front of it because little ants are terribly nearsighted. That ant you are focusing on is you as you march through time. And that string is a timeline of your entire life. Each ant is a snapshot of you at a different moment in your life. From your birth until your death. Now, in your imagination, zoom out, stand back, and look at the entire string all at once. You can easily see both ends. And you can now see yourself at all points along your life. None of it is past, none of it is future. But you can see your entire life right now, immediately, like it's all the present. That's how God sees your life. He already knew the end since way before the beginning. So there's nothing's there to surprise him, like it surprises us. Relax. It's all going according to plan. Now, this is not just hypothetical, but there's science to back it up. In 1970, astrophysicist Stephen Hawking, of all people, and Roger Penrose developed the first time-space theorem of general relativity. See me after if you want to discuss this more. They demonstrated mathematically that the ultimate transcendent cause of the universe, who we Christians call God, must exist in more dimensions of space and time than we have access to. See, here on Earth, we're trapped in only one dimension of time, and it only moves in one direction from past to future. But because God must have access to at least 2 dimensions of time, and probably more, he already has the big picture. You can see it all and handle all the details along the way in minute detail all at the same time. He's not limited like us. So your future is already God's past. He doesn't have to wait around until you get to some future challenge to help you through it, because from his perspective, you're already there. And he's already prepared you to handle it. In fact, he's already gotten you safely past it. So it's kind of a mind bender, isn't it? You don't even know that it's already happened. So God gives us the abundant life, but sometimes it seems delayed for reasons we don't know. One of my favorite verses from the Old Testament is from the prophet Joel, chapter 2, verse 25. At the time, Israel had experienced drought, a plague of locusts, then a famine, so times were rough. and they were losing hope. But God, through the prophet Joel, told them, I will restore to you the years that the locusts have eaten. Well, here's how it panned out in my own life, though it's not how I would have expected. For many years, I worked in a stable company in their IT department. That's sistemas in Spanish. I'd expected to continue working there until about age 70 and then retire in the United States. Very conventional. Well, late one night, 10 years ago, I was on a long drive back from a business trip, and I got to thinking about the direction of my life. And I prayed a little while about it in the quiet darkness, and suddenly, I sensed an almost audible voice say, clear the decks, clear the decks. Well, this surprised me greatly because nothing like that had ever happened to me before. So I asked, God, is that you speaking? I don't want to be led astray by my own imagination, or especially by the powers of darkness. But the sense of the words continued, and it persisted strongly for years. Now, I knew I had been somewhat dissatisfied that my life always felt too busy to get organized, and that was holding me back from growing and serving in the ways I wanted to. It seemed God was telling me to get all that mess straightened out and then be standing by and ready for whatever new thing He had for my future. I couldn't imagine what, or how, or when, but for now, my marching orders were to clear the decks of the current clutter. So I spent the next 5 years trying to do that, though with lots of interruptions. Susanna's father died of cancer. Her mom had died of cancer many years earlier. And so there was grief and some difficult family dynamics, which I'm sure some of you could probably relate to. Then my mother died of cancer. My father had died many years earlier. And I was her executor, and there was more deep grief to work through. And once we got our financial plan ironed out, I was disheartened to realize I would have to work longer than I thought before retiring. I was so tired of working in the corporate world, and I wanted an occupation that had more meaning. Meanwhile, I continued to live with cognitive dissonance, holding two divergent thoughts in my head at the same time. On the one hand, I still planned to work for another 10 or 15 years in the same company, and then retire into the same home we had for almost 30 years. But on the other hand, I continued to sense God preparing me for some kind of new adventure. And I even began to feel like a stranger in my own church and community, and that puzzled me. Then it came, suddenly. When I was nearly 60 years old, the company I'd worked at for 30 years announced a major reorganization and laid a bunch of people off. So now I was unemployed at an age when nobody would hire me at even half my former salary. The locusts were eating my security. But fortunately, a few months earlier, I had come across an article about retiring abroad on less money. So Susanna and I decided, let's go back to Japan and teach English for a few years, and then retire somewhere in Asia or Latin America. So we had some hope. But then more problems. I had major surgery, surprise, and a long, painful recovery. Then my dear wife had skin cancer, and then worse yet, a pancreatic cancer scare, which fortunately was not. And oral surgery, and a bunch of other medical issues. The locusts were eating our health. When the pandemic hit, Japan locked down hard for 3 years, and that door was slammed in our face. The locusts were eating our plans. Things were rough, and our savings continued to dwindle, but we kept swatting away at all these new problems that kept flying at us. Like, okay, what's this week's new insurmountable problem? The locusts were eating our time, our money, and our hope. Finally, after nearly 4 years of challenges and bad news, we finally got here. And do you know what? God really has been restoring the years the locusts had eaten. Our financial losses forced us to abandon our plans to retire in the U.S. So I got to move abroad again. It's something I'd long wanted to do ever since I got back from Japan. But I was too busy in my career and perhaps a little fearful. So God just gave me a little nudge. And here's a biggie. I got my 60s back, no longer having to work for the man for food and shelter. Instead, I could explore and serve while I still have the health, the energy, and the mobility. From the perspective of the ant on the string, all I had encountered were one problem after another. But God was already way ahead of me, preparing something far better than I could have planned for myself. Long ago, I had a year of Bible school and was involved in various ministries over the decades. But Cuenca seems to have more open doors than suburban Southern California did. Just before we moved to Ecuador, my pastor told me, I know we only have you for a short time yet, but God has an assignment for you that our church cannot contain. And here in Ecuador, I have had opportunities to grow in ways that I couldn't before, whether it be volunteering at the University of Cuenca, or teaching kids in a hillside village, or informally in a hiking group having ad hoc spiritual conversations with unchurched Ecuadorians and expats, or here at ICC like this. It is stretching me, yes, but in a way it also seems rather natural. And now I recognize over the years the many ways, over the decades, that God was preparing Susanna and I to move here. Many more ways than I could recount now, but that I only recognized in the rearview mirror. God knew what he was doing all along, even though I didn't. So let's sum up this Psalm 23, the first part. It describes how God is continually blessing our life abundantly. But what does that look like? It's not always so simple. First, remember that God really is a good shepherd, and we are his sheep. Say it with me, we're sheep. Bah. Thank you. Okay. Now, as a sheep, we are totally dependent on the shepherd, and he will take responsibility for our care. Thank you. Second, God trusts you enough to shine his glory through you to others. And sometimes it will hurt. But that's okay. He has already prepared you for it. And third, from God's perspective, your future has already happened. And he has already brought you safely over the finish line. Since you've already won the race, there's nothing to worry about between now and then. I often journal in the mornings to try to corral my wandering thoughts, bring them to God. Now, being the scientific type, I'm not into mysticism, but I am trying to learn to listen for God's Spirit more than before. Now, a few weeks ago, I was feeling really worn down and discouraged, very low. Because of my new injuries to my spine, you remember that, and then to my shoulder, it seemed to derail my life and usher in a new era of uncertainty. And I like certainty. So I was lamenting to God, saying things like, I feel overwhelmed, exhausted, totally inadequate to the challenges and even the opportunities that you've given me. I fear failure and desolation. God, you're welcome to take me home sooner rather than later, so I don't have to fret and struggle anymore. I feel done. But as I was lamenting my frailty and fears, I seemed to feel God interrupting me. And I heard these words of gentle admonishment. I believe in you. I believe in you. This was encouraging, but it also seemed a little backward to me. So, but then I heard him continuing. He says, why do you think I prepared you for all those years and did all those miracles to get you down here? And then he seemed to add, and this is key, I'll bring you home when I'm ready, not before. And until then, you are my responsibility. Don't be afraid. That message is not just for me, it's for all of us. Our great shepherd really is good. He thinks ahead. Let's rest on that. Thank you.
Now we can go home knowing that the power of God protects us, the love of God enfolds us. Wherever we are, God is and always, always be. Amen.